The Magnolia Crown lobby blazed under the chandelier lights as Richard Hale's cold, harsh voice sliced through the air. He swatted the room keycard from Avery Mitchell's hand. The plastic piece flipped onto the marble floor, spun a few times and lay still before the stunned gazes of the guests. Richard stepped forward, his breath carrying the scent of cologne and contempt straight into Avery's face. "We don't serve your kind here," he said, his voice even, with no need to hide his intent to humiliate. Avery stood still, hands relaxed, no reaction. Richard eyed her from head to toe, then suddenly swung his arm and slapped her hard. The sound echoed throughout the lobby, loud enough that a nearby employee froze mid-motion. Avery staggered half a step, but didn't lower her gaze, didn't retaliate. Her composure made the surrounding space seem to halt. Richard didn't know, and didn't care to know, that the person he'd just slapped wasn't some troublesome black girl. She was the daughter of the only woman who held complete control over his entire future, and that woman was on her way here. But a few minutes before that slap occurred, the morning at Magnolia Crown had been proceeding in its familiar rhythm, orderly to the point where no one imagined a single guest entering would shift everything off course. Light from the high skylight windows along the ceiling poured down onto the stone-floored lobby, illuminating every detail clearly. Guests came and went constantly. Staff moved according to ingrained procedures. People pulling suitcases, people waiting for cars, people checking phones while in line. Everything operated just like any other morning. No one noticed the young woman who had just stepped through the main doors. Avery Mitchell entered, carrying what seemed like an ordinary morning, until everything suddenly became the focal point of the entire hotel. Avery Mitchell paused for a second to survey her surroundings. She gently adjusted the strap of her small suitcase, took a deep breath, and headed straight to the front desk. Her outfit was neat and simple, a thin cream-colored coat, dark pants, flat shoes, no jewelry, no designer bag, nothing that would immediately suggest luxury to others. She arrived like an ordinary guest. She stood at the front desk, handed over her documents, and said clearly, "I'm here to check in. Name Mitchell." The receptionist was a young woman. She looked at Avery for a moment before lowering her eyes to the screen. Her fingers moved a bit slowly. Avery noticed this delay. It wasn't due to a system error. It wasn't because of an overload of guests. It was because the receptionist was trying to confirm something in her own mind. She glanced at Avery once more, then looked to her colleague, as if waiting for support. No one said anything. Avery remained calm, placing her other hand on the suitcase. In the left corner of the lobby, Richard Hale was emerging from the manager's office. He held a stack of files, eyes directed toward the front desk. When he saw Avery, his steps slowed. Richard was tall and imposing, hair slicked back, tie perfectly straight. Every movement showed he was accustomed to giving orders rather than serving. He approached the desk, set the files down on the counter, his gaze sweeping Avery from top to bottom. No goodwill, no welcome, just evaluation. "How can I assist you?" Richard asked in a light but unfriendly tone. Avery turned to him, eyes direct. "I'm here to check in. Name Mitchell." Richard tilted his head slightly. "Mitchell, are you traveling alone?" Avery nodded. She didn't explain further. She didn't feel the need to say she'd booked the room 3 weeks ago, had paid a deposit, had followed the exact procedures for every other guest. The receptionist waited for Richard's guidance. Richard didn't look at the screen. He just said, "We need additional documents." Avery handed over her passport and confirmation code. Richard glanced at them, then set them down without opening them. "We need to verify more information." He didn't say why verification was needed. He didn't specify what needed verifying. He didn't explain why this procedure didn't apply to the guests who'd just been served in under 2 minutes at the next counter. The security guard, signaled by Richard, stepped closer. The guard stood a short distance from Avery. Not directly threatening, but his presence was intentional. Avery looked up. "I've provided all the required documents. I want to check in like the other guests." Richard emphasized each word. We need more time to check. Check what? Avery asked. Richard flashed a cold smile. For now, just wait. Avery stood her ground, keeping her voice even. If there's an issue with the booking, you can tell me directly, Richard replied. The issue isn't with us. It's whether you're suitable for this place. That statement changed the atmosphere around the front desk. A few staff glanced over. Some nearby guests turned their heads. Avery didn't change her expression. I haven't done anything against the rules. Richard waved dismissively at the receptionist, signaling her to stop processing the file. We have our own standards here. Not everyone meets them. Avery took a breath, her voice low but clear. I've paid. I have the confirmation code. If the hotel cancels the room, I want the reason in writing. Richard leaned forward. I'm asking you one last time. Do you want to leave here quietly, or do we need to escort you out? The security guard stepped closer. The receptionist bowed her head over the keyboard, avoiding Avery's gaze. Those waiting to check in at the next counter began whispering. A woman behind Avery subtly stepped back, as if wanting to avoid involvement. Avery didn't step back, didn't look away from Richard. I'm just requesting to be treated according to the rules. Richard let out a short laugh. Don't you understand the situation? He moved even closer, the distance between them now half a step. His voice lowered, sharp and clear. I suggest you leave before things get complicated. All activity in the lobby seemed to slow. The security guard stood straighter. The doorman glanced over. Two guests sipping coffee nearby stopped talking. No one intervened. No one defended Avery. Not a single voice of protest. Only the tension spreading in widening circles. Avery held her gaze steady. No avoidance. No sign of fear. In that moment, she understood one thing clearly. She would not leave. Not out of stubbornness. But because she knew if she left the way Richard wanted, then people like her, those who entered without status or connections, would always be pushed out the same way. The Magnolia Crown lobby grew quieter. The eyes of those around were directed toward them. Richard waited for Avery's response. Avery still stood there, hand on the suitcase strap, shoulders straight, voice soft but consistent. I'll stay until I get a reasonable explanation. And that very statement, combined with the way Avery stood firm under pressure, caused everything in the lobby, which had seemed to flow smoothly as usual, to start veering off its track. This was the first moment that changed the entire space of Magnolia Crown. And in that tense atmosphere, Avery still stood in place, hand on the suitcase, while Richard exhaled a long breath, clearly losing patience. He turned to the receptionist, saying like an order, I told you to check more information. The receptionist startled, nodding repeatedly, even though she didn't know what more to check. Richard's irritation grew more evident. He glanced at Avery, then around the lobby, as if to demonstrate that her presence was disrupting the order here. Avery remained calm, but in her mind was the reason she was at Magnolia Crown this morning. She'd just graduated from college 2 weeks ago. For years, her mother, Avery Mitchell, had spoken of Magnolia Crown as one of the hotels built on a philosophy of valuing people. Avery wanted to verify it herself. She hadn't announced it, hadn't called her mother's assistant to arrange the room, hadn't revealed her identity. She wanted to see how the system operated when she entered anonymously. If the hotel was truly fair as the original goal her mother had mentioned, then who she was wouldn't matter. She just needed to arrive as an ordinary guest. But what was unfolding before her eyes was showing her a different reality. Richard crossed his arms. This hotel isn't for people just dropping by. His voice lingered on the last two words, exposing raw contempt. Avery looked straight at him, unyielding. I'm just checking in legally. Richard let out a short, unfriendly laugh. You don't look like the kind of guest we serve. Those waiting to check in at the next counter heard that. A few glanced at Avery, then turned away, as if wanting to avoid trouble. A staff member near the door bowed his head, not daring to look further. Richard didn't stop there. He stepped a bit closer again. You think just giving a name gets you served? Not everyone fits Magnolia Crown. Avery breathed deeply, her voice still clearly calm. I fit the rules the hotel sets. Richard responded with a snort. Rules are one thing. Reality is another. He turned to the security guard. If she keeps causing trouble, escort her out. Avery didn't back down, but she felt very clearly the shift in the lobby. An invisible pressure weighed heavily on the surrounding space. Whispers appeared in distant corners, then vanished. A water server passing by looked at Avery, started to smile reassuringly, but turned away immediately when Richard glanced over. Richard leaned closer to Avery, voice low, sharp, and unrestrained. I don't have time for stubborn people. You should leave. That was the voice of someone no longer maintaining outward calm. No more social distance. No more pretending politeness. Only disdain. And in the silence enveloping the lobby now, the sense of violence was drawing very close. Not loud violence, but the violence of abused power, waiting for the slightest excuse to erupt. A few staff bowed their heads, avoiding Avery's gaze. No one said anything. No one stopped it. No one stood between them. All signs indicated that what was about to happen would go far beyond a dispute over check-in procedures, and Avery sensed it without a single doubt. Immediately following the moment Richard lost control of his voice, Avery still stood in her original spot, both hands gripping the suitcase strap tightly, eyes not leaving the face of the man trying to impose power on her. She didn't back away even half a step, didn't lower her voice, didn't change her posture. Her silence made Richard even more uncomfortable. He tilted his head, staring directly at Avery, as if her calm was an insulting act. Are you challenging me? Richard said louder, his voice starting to carry beyond the front desk. A few guests turned their heads. A staff member in the hallway leading to the restaurant paused, eyes toward the desk. Attention in the lobby gradually focused on the two. Richard inhaled sharply, his voice continuing to rise. I told you to leave. What are you still standing here for? Avery didn't budge. I'm waiting for a reasonable explanation. That very response made Richard laugh dryly. The laugh held no intent to reconcile. Who do you think you are to make demands here? A flash of silence. Then Richard suddenly raised his hand. No warning, no restraint, no chance for Avery to dodge. His palm struck Avery's cheek, with enough force that the sound echoed across the front desk area, carrying all the way to the waiting seats. The slap resounded, clear and sharp, instantly halting all conversations around it. The Magnolia Crown lobby fell dead silent, Avery's head tilted from the impact, her feet stumbling half a step. She placed a hand on the suitcase to steady herself. No cry, no gasp, no reflex to hold her face. She just stood still, slightly tilted, then slowly turned her head back, eyes fixed on Richard, as if looking at something she'd known would happen, but still wanted to give the other person one last chance. Richard hadn't expected his slap to fail to create the panic he assumed. He backed up slightly, as if Avery's calm reaction made him uneasy. Avery spoke very softly, but each word clear enough that no one in the lobby could mishear. You've just done something irreparable. A water server a few meters away widened his eyes. The young receptionist trembled so much she nearly dropped the keyboard. The security guard, who had stood at Richard's command, now froze, unsure whether to intervene or step back. An elderly couple looked at Avery with eyes entirely different from when they'd entered. Not pity, not curiosity, but recognition of excessive composure in a situation where most people would scream or break down crying. Marcus, farther away pushing a luggage cart, heard the slap and looked over. His face tensed. Denise, still behind the counter, raised a hand to her mouth, not from fear of Richard, but because she'd just realized something very strange about Avery, something that made her feel this young woman wasn't like the ordinary guests, usually demeaned in this lobby. The atmosphere in the lobby shifted. Guests began looking at Richard with confusion. A few who saw Avery stand straight-backed after the slap changed their eyes, as if they'd just seen something they hadn't noticed initially. The silence enveloping all of Magnolia Crown now wasn't ordinary silence. It was held breaths, gazes directed at Avery and Richard, thoughts racing through witnesses' minds that the slap had opened something far beyond a check-in dispute. For the first time since entering, Avery didn't need to say more to make everyone understand the boundary had been torn, and the lobby's atmosphere was changing in a way no one could predict. She still stood there, hand on the suitcase strap, eyes unwavering, and her composure was the first thing that made a few staff at Magnolia Crown realize the person they'd treated with contempt might not be who they thought. Right after Avery's words, the Magnolia Crown lobby fell into a strange state. No footsteps, no suitcase wheels rolling on stone, no more "have a good day" greetings from the doorman. The air thickened for a few prolonged seconds, as if all sounds in the building were held behind the glass doors. Guests near the front desk turned away faster than usual, eyes glued to phones with dark screens, fingers scrolling without really reading. A couple waiting to check in froze. The wife lightly touched her husband's arm, but didn't dare look toward the center of the incident. A water server set his tray down too hard on a table. The small clatter rang loud in the quiet. Then he quickly bent to retrieve the glasses and left immediately. No one spoke. No one defended. No one opposed Richard. Everyone stood in the tension they tried to hide, pretending not to know what had just happened right before their eyes. Richard Hale breathed heavily, as if trying to dispel some feeling in his throat. He adjusted his shirt cuff slowly and deliberately, then smoothed the front crease. He raised his head, scanning the lobby with eyes demanding everything return to normal. "Continue serving guests," Richard said, not loudly but enough for nearby staff to hear. The receptionist nodded repeatedly, turning back to the screen, fingers typing randomly without knowing what. Richard inhaled deeply, then waved at the security guard, as if the slap was just necessary to resolve the issue. He turned to Avery, glancing briefly but not lingering, then back to the staff. Nothing happened. The words fell into the heavy air, cold and dry, like an order forcing everyone to pretend what they'd witnessed didn't exist. Avery stood still a few more seconds after the slap. She placed her hand back on the suitcase strap, adjusting it to stand properly beside her. A small but careful motion. She didn't cry, didn't tremble visibly, didn't do anything to make others think she was about to lose control. Only her right hand shook slightly, a faint tremor enough for the perceptive to notice but not for Richard to see. Avery turned to find an empty spot nearby, and walked to a waiting chair. Her footsteps were barely audible in the enveloping silence. She sat down, back straight, as if her spine was holding itself up. Her eyes looked straight ahead. Not at Richard, not at the receptionist, not at those hiding behind their shell of silence. She sat like a pocket of stillness in a crowded space. Her calm made those who'd witnessed the slap feel even more breathless. A baggage handler passing by, startled upon seeing Avery sitting there, but quickly bowed his head and turned another way. An elderly guest a few meters away opened his mouth as if to say something, but upon seeing Richard's sweeping gaze, closed it and turned to his phone screen. The entire space seemed united in fulfilling Richard's sole demand: pretend nothing happened, and that very act exposed the truth. Avery had wanted to verify by arriving anonymously this morning the truth about how people behave when unsupervised, when no status forces kindness, and when power is given to the unworthy. Silent, but no one in the lobby truly escaped the weight of the recent slap. At Magnolia Crown, time in this moment seemed frozen, leaving only three states: silence, fear, and shame. No one had the courage to admit. Just as the Magnolia Crown lobby remained submerged in that heavy silence, Denise Walker, the oldest morning shift receptionist, glanced at Avery again. Avery's hand on her knee still trembled faintly, but her face maintained the composure that made Denise feel unease in her chest. Not unease toward Avery, unease toward herself and what had just happened. Denise quickly glanced at Richard. He was bent over signing a log, pretending to be busy, acting as if the slap was just a minor interruption in the morning schedule. No one stopped him. No one spoke, and that made Denise restless. She set the log down on the counter, whispered to the young receptionist beside her that she'd step back for a moment. Without waiting for a reply, Denise left the desk with unusually quick steps for a long-time hotel employee. In seconds, she returned with a neatly folded cold towel in hand, and a glass of water still steaming cold on the surface. Without looking at Richard or anyone else, she walked straight to Avery. She didn't ask, "Are you okay?" Didn't ask, "Can I help?" Didn't ask the polite but empty questions hotel staff are trained to ask. Denise simply placed the towel on the chair arm next to Avery, then set the glass beside it. A light glance met Avery's eyes before she spoke very softly, audible only to the two. "You don't have to go through this alone." Avery turned. Her eyes held no heavy gratitude, just recognition, a light nod. Wordless, but enough. Denise lingered a beat, as if confirming Avery was still okay, then walked back to the front desk. But her movements were no longer the same. She no longer bowed her head passing Richard, no longer avoided his gaze. She walked like someone who'd just chosen her side. Farther away, Marcus Reed, the baggage handler, stood near the stainless steel cart. He'd observed the entire incident from Richard's demand for extra documents to the slap. Marcus wasn't one to interfere with management. But seeing Denise place the towel, he naturally felt he needed to do something. Marcus gently pushed the luggage cart aside, stepped closer to Avery, positioning slightly to her right, not touching her, not speaking, but his position meant anyone from Richard's direction approaching Avery would have to pass him first. He stood as if just waiting for work instructions, but his eyes followed Richard directly, ready if something else happened. That small change spread quickly, though no one spoke a word. A water server, who'd set his tray down hard earlier, paused midway between the bar and front desk. He stood still, holding the empty tray, eyes watching Avery and Richard, waiting to see if help was needed. Near the entrance, another security guard entering from the front courtyard took 2 steps before hearing Richard call out, "Maintain order. Unauthorized personnel stay away from this area." But that guard didn't advance. He looked at Avery, then Richard, then Marcus, blocking half a step. He hesitated, not advancing as usual. The hesitation wasn't large, but enough for Richard to frown in annoyance. From behind the front desk, the young employee, who'd typed frantically earlier from fear, stood a bit straighter. Her hands still trembled, but she'd stopped typing. She glanced at Avery, then at Denise returning to duty, and in her eyes was a calm absent before. None of them openly opposed Richard. None loudly protested. None stepped forward to say the slap was wrong. But the Magnolia Crown lobby no longer sided with Richard. A few gazes shifted. A few bodies repositioned. A few small actions emerged like silent signals that the slap had gone too far. And while Richard still stood there, thinking he'd re-established order, what was actually changing was the balance in the lobby. Quietly, slowly, but surely. Kindness doesn't come from declarations. It appears from steps slowing when needed, from a cold towel placed at the right moment, from a staff member standing a bit closer, despite possible reprimand, from a guard not advancing despite orders. Small things, but they were shifting the wind in Magnolia Crown right before Richard's eyes, without him realizing. Avery still sat quietly, hand on the suitcase, eyes forward, but now she no longer sat alone. For the first time since stepping through the hotel doors, behind her calm were people choosing to stand near, even if only through very small gestures, but gestures where truth always begins. Just as the first quiet acts of kindness appeared around her, Avery knew she couldn't let the incident pass as Richard wanted. She stood up, grasped the suitcase strap, and walked toward a less noticed corner of the lobby. Her movement drew a few following eyes, not from curiosity, but worry that something worse might happen if Richard noticed her leaving her spot. Avery stood beside a large stone pillar, back lightly against the cool surface, then took out her phone. Her fingers swiped once and stopped at the only name she needed to call now. Mom. When the ringtone sounded, Avery looked down at the floor, breathing evenly. Her voice in the first sentence was so calm, that those nearby might misunderstand nothing serious had happened. "I'm fine, but something happened at Magnolia Crown." On the other end, Elaine Mitchell didn't reply immediately. A silence lasting a few seconds, enough for Avery to know her mother was trying to stay calm. When Elaine spoke, her voice wasn't high or rushed, just the low tone Avery had heard many times in the tensest situations. "Are you hurt?" Avery closed her eyes briefly. Her cheek still felt warm, where Richard's hand had landed. But she didn't want that pain to derail the story from what mattered more. "No," Avery said slowly, surely, then opened her eyes, looking straight at the lobby where Richard was directing staff, as if nothing had occurred. "But others will be, if this continues." The other end paused again. No chair scraping, no hurried footsteps, no suppressed worry, no questions like what happened, who did it, why, as many mothers would ask immediately. Elaine Mitchell asked no details, no probing, no elaboration, just one sentence, each word clear. "Stay there, don't leave." Avery heard that instruction, and felt her spine tighten, not from fear, but because her mother's voice wasn't ordinary advice. It was the voice of someone knowing exactly the severity, understanding that her silence, or leaving now, would bury everything that happened, immediately. No one accountability, no one forced to reflect on their actions. Avery replied softly, "Yes, nothing more." She didn't recount the slap, didn't mention the avoiding eyes, didn't describe the horror on the young receptionist's face. She didn't need to. Elaine understood enough from her daughter's breathing alone. Avery pocketed the phone, stood straight again. When she walked back to the front desk area, Marcus slightly shifted to make way, his eyes tracking Richard's every move in case he did something again. Denise glanced at Avery once more, as she returned to the chair. Avery sat down, back still straight, but a small change in her eyes. No longer the gaze of someone caught in an uncontrollable situation, but the gaze of someone knowing she's in the exact position she needs to be, at least until the woman on the other end appears, and ensures this story isn't buried in silence again. When Avery sat back in the waiting chair, the lobby atmosphere was completely different from minutes before. Richard noticed the change immediately. He looked around, seeing a server standing too long near the water station, seeing the guard no longer in the ordered position, seeing Denise back at the desk but eyes no longer lowered as usual. Each small detail made Richard feel observed, judged, scrutinized in every move. It made him so uncomfortable he could hardly breathe. He stepped out from behind the counter, advancing a few steps toward Avery. "This situation has gone on long enough," Richard said, his voice louder than normal. A few guests startled and looked up. No more pretended calm, no more attempted politeness. Richard's voice revealed the loss of control he'd tried to hide. Richard pointed at Avery, ordering clearly, "Escort her out." The nearby guard looked at Richard, then Avery, then back at Richard. He hesitated. The entire lobby sensed that hesitation. Richard frowned. "I said, escort her out." But the guard didn't move. None had ever seen a colleague do this. Stand still on a direct management order. Not because he wanted to defy, but because from the moment the slap echoed, everything in the lobby was no longer as before. Marcus, half a step from Avery, gently pushed the luggage cart aside for space, but he didn't leave his position in front of her. He blocked between Richard and Avery, in a non-confrontational way, but enough that anyone approaching Avery would pass him first. A prolonged silence enveloped everyone. Avery glanced at her hands for a second, then looked up, eyes calm as when she'd first entered the hotel. Denise, behind the counter, looked directly at Richard. No bowing, no avoidance, no more fearful submission. This was the first moment in many years at the hotel that Denise didn't prioritize her safety through silence. Richard grew increasingly frustrated. He advanced a step, but Marcus shifted his foot accordingly, not aggressively, not tense, but clearly a boundary set. Richard looked around, hoping for support from other staff, but saw only stillness, eyes wary toward him. No one spoke, no shouting, no argument erupting. But that silence was heavier than any yelling. The air was so tense that one wrong word, One mistimed step could shatter everything. Guests farther away began standing straighter, putting phones down, watching directly instead of pretending uninvolved. A man who'd witnessed the slap subtly moved out of line, as if preparing to act if things exceeded limits. Richard saw it all, and what irritated him most was no one sided with him anymore. Avery didn't move. She said nothing to fuel the fire, no strong reaction, no challenge, but her silence, absolute composure, made Richard feel his power, which he'd always believed inviolable, gradually slipping. 7 minutes had passed since the slap, each like a countdown tick, and at Magnolia Crown, where everything seemed perfectly operated, the power balance was tilting in silence, slowly but irreversibly. Before Avery Mitchell appeared, the hotel lobby had begun detaching from Richard. No need to shout, no need to oppose. But every gaze, every slight retreat, every wordless refusal showed clearly, old power was cracking piece by piece, and no one hid it anymore. Amid the Magnolia Crown lobby tense like a string about to snap, the front revolving door moved lightly. No rushed heels, no bodyguards clearing the way, no staff rushing to greet. A woman entered the lobby quietly, as if she'd been there all along. Avery Mitchell stood right in the beam of light from the main door. She wore a long dark coat, buttoned shirt, pressed pants, low leather shoes, not ostentatiously luxurious, not hiding power but no need to display it. Her hair tied neatly back, face without heavy makeup, but her absolute composure made those nearby unconsciously stand straighter, and those chatting softly cautiously lower voices. Elaine didn't walk quickly, each step sufficiently firm. She didn't need to glance sideways to know what was happening in the lobby. When her eyes swept the front desk area, all activity seemed to slow automatically. Richard saw her first. He paused half a second, not from recognizing her, but from her appearance carrying an inexplicable feeling. Elaine's gaze stopped on Avery's face. No questions, no touch, no exaggerated emotion. Just a long, deep enough look to absorb everything needed. The red mark on Avery's cheek caught her eye. Elaine shifted her gaze to Richard. No frown, no glare, no asking what happened. But that look made Richard feel as if someone had placed a mirror before him, forcing him to see himself in every detail. In just seconds, Elaine had assessed the lobby layout, Marcus blocking half a step, Denise standing straight behind the counter, the hesitating guard, a few staff shifted aside, guests watching with wary silence. She noted it all without anyone explaining. No one in the lobby knew who she was. No one knew that without a name tag or announcement, this woman still decided everything where they stood. Elaine advanced one step. Richard tried to maintain managerial poise, standing straighter, acting as if he'd regained control. But Elaine's eyes remained on him, longer than any in the lobby. Those seconds made Richard's palms start sweating. Avery watched from the waiting chair. No one knew what mother and daughter had said or prepared. But Elaine's stance, unhurried, undisturbed, unchaotic, made the entire lobby clearly sense. Something was entering this space, completely altering that morning's rhythm. Elaine stood a few meters from Richard. She didn't apologize for interrupting, didn't greet anyone, didn't introduce herself. She uttered only the first sentence, voice so calm no one could guess if angry, or just asking normally, "Who's in charge of this shift?" The question rang out not loudly, not raised, but the Magnolia Crown lobby heard it as if someone had placed an order on the table. Richard opened his mouth to reply, but somehow his throat caught half a second before sound emerged. Nearby staff reflexively looked at him, but their eyes quickly returned to the woman who'd entered, as if knowing today's answer would differ. Elaine still looked at Richard. No blink, no movement, just waiting. But that gaze was enough to make the entire hotel understand. Power had entered this lobby without needing introduction for all to recognize. Right after Elaine's question echoed, the lobby silence deepened. No one stirred. No one breathed heavily. Avery still sat in the waiting chair, eyes on her mother but silent. Elaine didn't turn to her daughter. She didn't ask Avery what happened. Like a mother's instinct, she kept her gaze on Richard, then slowly shifted to the nearest staff. "Denise." "You?" Elaine said, voice calm but weighted. "Tell me what happened from the beginning." Denise behind the counter clasped her hands. She glanced at Avery briefly, inhaled, stepped out from the front desk to stand straight before Elaine. She didn't avoid, didn't seek softening words, didn't ask Richard's permission. Her voice firm, even, not trembling as when the slap sounded. From when she entered, everything followed procedure, Denise said. Eyes directed Elaine. She gave the booking name, gave documents, gave confirmation code. Nothing missing. Richard fidgeted as if to interrupt, but Elaine raised a hand lightly, demanding silence, and he swallowed his words. Denise continued. The manager requested extra documents not required by procedure. Then he had security stand close. No reason. No warning. She paused a beat, then said clearly, each word distinct. Then he slapped her. No sound in the lobby, except her recounting voice. She didn't embellish, didn't color the story. She said exactly what happened, in chronological order, without omitting key points. When Denise finished, Marcus stepped forward one step, unprompted. He stood straight, hands behind back from professional habit, but voice firmer than any time he'd spoken in this hotel. I was about 5 meters away, Marcus said. I saw everything. He glanced at Richard, then Elaine. She did nothing wrong, no yelling, no demands, just requested treatment like a normal guest. Marcus lowered his voice slightly but still clear. He slapped her without warning. Elaine listened. No interruption, no emotion shown. She just nodded lightly to acknowledge Marcus. A nearby water server looked around, then gripped his tray for courage. He stepped up, voice slightly trembling, but decided. I saw it too. A housekeeping staff passing the lobby. Stopped, hands clasped in front. I wasn't as close, but I heard the sound. I turned and saw her slapped. Another, the young receptionist from earlier, hands still faintly trembling, but this time not bowing her head. She stepped out from behind the counter beside Denise. I saw, she said softly, but clearly. I stayed silent, because I was scared. A tear threatened, but she held it, scared of being fired, scared of confronting management. But what happened was completely wrong. 2 staff near the doors looked at each other. One advanced half a step. We also heard the manager yelling at the victim before slapping. Another nodded. One by one, staff who had always stayed silent in the hotel's harsh operations began speaking. No yelling, no harsh criticism of Richard. They just recounted the truth they'd tried to avoid facing minutes ago, and their speaking changed the lobby atmosphere entirely. No longer heavy from fear, but a different heaviness. Shame. Shame for seeing but not speaking. Shame for letting their silence shield Richard's wrongful power. The elegant, polished Magnolia Crown lobby now stood in an undeniable atmosphere. Truth had been spoken. No shouting, no arguing, no defending. Just straightforward accounts, sentence by sentence, repositioning the entire story correctly before the only woman they knew could surely change everything in this moment. Elaine Mitchell. Elaine. Let the recounted truth settle for a few seconds. She didn't rush to look at anyone, or comment. That silence wasn't like the heavy one when Richard slapped Avery. This was the silence of someone viewing the full picture, weighing each piece, deciding how to place everything where it belonged. When she spoke, volume unchanged, but each word fell so clearly no one in the lobby could miss a syllable. I am Elaine Mitchell. The Magnolia Crown lobby made no sound. No one asked, who are you? No one acted confused. Even Richard couldn't react immediately. Elaine paused briefly, long enough for the first statement to embed in the max tension. Then she continued slowly, each word placed precisely. I am the owner of this hotel. A guest in the waiting area lightly dropped his phone onto the cushion. A server startled, hand trembling, then quickly steadying the water tray. A guard near the door stood fully straight, face losing usual composure. Richard opened his mouth but no sound emerged. His eyelids twitched slightly, throat moving as if swallowing hot air. He stood frozen, hands clenching as if hiding something, entire body rigid, no excuse found. Elaine didn't look at Richard another second. She turned to Avery, still in the waiting chair, back straight, hands lightly on the suitcase. No words to her daughter, no questions, no hug, no comfort. She spoke for the entire lobby, voice calm but firm. "And she is my daughter." 3 sentences, no further explanation, no proof needed, not a power declaration, not a threat, just truth spoken at the right time. Finally, all of Magnolia Crown seemed jolted from tense silence. A few guests gaped. A woman raised a hand to her chest, eyes wide. Staff around the front desk held breath. A few reflexively looked at Avery with new eyes. Not pity or surprise, but realization. She wasn't just the slapped girl in this morning's lobby, but someone whose presence held value they hadn't suspected. Richard stood petrified, his face pale, lips moving silently. He didn't know where to look, what to say. Every word he'd said, yelled, forced, deliberately demeaned, now stood erect before him like an unbreakable wall. No cheers, no applause, no congratulations or relief. This wasn't a joyous moment. This was truth dropping into the lobby like a heavy block, resetting that morning's entire order. Those silent before the slap felt heat along their spines. Those who'd sided with Avery through small gestures felt something released in their chests but dared not show. No noise, no table pounding, no arguing. Just a slow, silent, profound shift. The Magnolia Crown lobby, understanding the wind had officially turned. Elaine stood still, letting the entire Magnolia Crown space absorb the meaning from her recent words. She didn't move, didn't shift posture, but her presence weight made everyone feel as if standing before an invisible scale, where behaviors from minutes ago were reassessed unrelentingly. Not through anger, but absolute transparency. Elaine lowered her eyes to the gloves on her hands, gently removing one and placing it in her coat pocket. When she looked up, her gaze didn't go to Richard but swept all staff standing in a tense circle around the front desk area. "I want to clarify further," she said, voice unchanged but heavier in ears. "The questions I asked weren't to accuse, but to see who understands their responsibility." No one moved. Elaine continued. "In a hotel, service skills matter. Procedures matter. Yes, experience matters. But ethics decide who deserves to stand here." She stepped closer. Enough for all eyes on her. Enough no one thought they could evade. "When I asked who assaulted," she said, "I wanted to know who directly caused harm." Her gaze finally stopped on Richard. Not harshly. The look of someone no longer expecting truth from him. The look no longer needing an answer, as truth was too clear in others' accounts. "When I asked who saw," Elaine continued, "I wanted to know who dares face truth, even when difficult." She looked at Denise, Marcus, the young receptionist trying to stay calm. They didn't look away. She didn't praise, but her gaze made them stand straighter, as if silently confirmed their speaking was right. "When I asked who chose silence," she said, voice lowering, "I didn't mean to insult anyone. I understand fear of job loss. I understand hierarchy pressure. I understand cowardice sometimes. Isn't from bad nature, but from habit of no protection when speaking truth." A few staff bowed heads. Others clenched hands. But no one fled responsibility. Elaine said each word clearly. But silence doesn't vanish with time. It leaves marks. And today it left marks across this entire lobby. She stepped once more, closer to Richard, but maintaining distance to avoid personal confrontation. She turned to the group who'd stepped forward earlier. "When I asked who stood up," she said, "I wanted to know who has enough character to protect the vulnerable when wrongful power appears." Marcus inhaled deeply. Denise nodded lightly. The earlier hesitating guard advanced a step, as if saying he sided with truth. Elaine nodded once, very small, acknowledging they'd stepped forward timely, but not praise, just a period on recognition. She continued, I don't categorize people by title, not by name tag, not by years worked. I categorize by actions and moments. Conscience is tested. Those words made Richard clench hands tighter. He breathed unevenly, eyes searching for support, but meeting none on his side. Staff who'd once bowed to him now avoided his gaze. Not from fear but shame, realizing the true nature of the man they'd respected and feared. Elaine didn't need to look at Richard to know his thoughts. She just continued. Some show power through yelling, orders, threats. But that's not power. That's fear in disguise. She tilted her head slightly, voice steady calm. Real power doesn't need to shout. The lobby air thickened to where no one stirred. She continued, voice a notch lower. Real power lies in making others see themselves without force. Nearby staff nodded faintly, acknowledging the words pierced them deeply. Elaine looked around, gaze no longer just on the staff group but encompassing guests standing motionless around the front desk. Everyone faces tests at times, she said, and that moment decides far more than people think. She paused, then said clearly, today is that moment. She placed a hand lightly on the counter. No tapping, no pounding, but the motion made all nearby stand straighter. And today, she concluded, truth has spoken more than enough. Elaine inhaled slowly, final gaze stopping on Richard. No threat, no contempt. Simply informing him of something he lacked courage to see himself. His time at Magnolia Crown was over. No one moved. No one spoke. Everyone awaited what came next. What they knew had no retreat. Right after Elaine looked directly at Richard, and let truth place him correctly, she stepped back half a step to mark the boundary between assessment and action. The Magnolia Crown lobby air was so tense. A strong breath could startle everyone. Elaine didn't need to raise her voice, but each word still fell ice cold. Richard Hale, he startled as if yanked from a bad dream. You are fired. Effective immediately. No heavy breaths. No applause. No cheers. The decision didn't create dramatic climax as many might think. It just fell where it belonged. Like an obvious outcome from the second he raised his hand to slap Avery. Richard opened his mouth. Perhaps to say I can explain, or it's not as you heard. But no voice escaped. He looked around for support, but all eyes avoided, not from fear of implication, but no one wanted to share air with his behavior anymore. Elaine still looked at him, voice calm. You no longer have the right to remain in this area. HR will guide you on handing over files later. Without waiting for reaction, she turned to security. Escort him from the hotel. The two guards no longer hesitated. They approached, not roughly, but decisively. Richard looked around one last time, eyes chaotic and red with anger, but no chance to say anything. He was led out the door in absolute silence. No one watched him longer than a beat, knowing this wasn't a spectacle to enjoy, but the consequence of his choice. Elaine waited until the revolving door closed behind Richard before turning to the entire morning shift staff. She didn't stand taller, no podium, no using position for hierarchy. She stood on the same floor, but the lobby's breath waited as if she stood highest. Now, Elaine said, I will decide for the entire morning shift. Some staff swallowed dryly, others bowed heads. But no one fled her gaze. Those who witnessed from the start, Elaine said clearly, and did nothing, said nothing, protected no guest, will have contracts terminated, effective immediately. A small gasp from the counter. A young receptionist raised hand to mouth, not offended, but truth suddenly hitting with its logic. Elaine continued, I understand fear of job loss. I understand pressure, but I cannot let this hotel operate under a culture where silence is normal. A few staff began tearing up, but Elaine didn't soften. Those who stood up, even small steps, even just presence, will not have contracts terminated. Marcus looked up. Denise exhaled lightly. The earlier hesitating guard blinked rapidly to stay composed. Elaine looked at each. Campbell. She named a staff near the bar. You stayed observing during tension. You didn't leave. You continue work. The man nodded strongly, eyes red. Jordan, Elaine to the young receptionist, you stayed silent when you shouldn't. But you were first to admit it. You'll have a separate HR meeting to review role. Not terminated today. The girl burst into relieved tears. Elaine turned to Marcus. You stood in the right place. Marcus just nodded, speechless. Then to Denise. You acted when no one did. You stay at Magnolia Crown. Denise bowed, not from fear, but emotion. Then Elaine scanned the entire shift group. All remaining, who turned away, avoided, pretended not to see. Contracts terminated today. No yelling, no begging mercy, no arguing. Those named didn't cling, didn't self-defend. They just stood still, realizing words now were meaningless. Elaine added, this decision isn't personal punishment. It's to protect the values this hotel was built on from the start. She looked at the entire lobby finally, voice light but undeniable. At Magnolia Crown, no one is allowed silence before injustice. No heads bowed in defeat, no raised in victory, no joy, no climax, no applause. Just inevitability. The inevitability of a system just tested by truth, and the inevitability of consequences it must bear. In 7 minutes from Elaine's entry, the entire shift power structure collapsed, not by shouting, not by violence, but by straightforwardness. No one could escape. Magnolia Crown stood in that silence, a silence no longer Richard's, but belonging to justice just repositioned. Right after Richard was escorted out by security, Magnolia Crown sank into a post-storm hush. The air smelled different, no longer tense on the verge of breaking, but the heavy emptiness of executed consequences. Richard was led through the revolving door, face pale from humiliation and anger. As he reached the sidewalk, a group of reporters appeared as if waiting long. They rushed forward, mics thrust at him. Mr. Hale, any comment on this morning's incident? Is it true you assaulted a female guest? Richard wanted to say something, but words stuck in his throat. A guard lightly pushed his shoulder, forcing continued walking. No stop for more chaos. That image, with midday light on Richard's dazed face, would reach headlines in minutes. Inside the hotel, Avery stood. She didn't look around to see who watched, didn't seek defense or sympathetic eyes. She just took the suitcase and walked straight to the front desk. As she went, cameras immediately turned toward her through the glass doors. A reporter rushed in. Are you the assaulted person? Do you want to share your feelings? Any statement on Mrs. Mitchell's decision? Avery didn't stop, didn't speed up, no rush, didn't glance left or right. Her composure made reporters pause slightly, as if the expected anger, declaration, or emotional collapse didn't exist in her. As Avery passed the front desk, Denise behind it looked with eyes full of emotion. No words needed. Marcus stepped lightly aside to clear path, face serious but respectful, and as Avery passed a young staff who'd admitted her silence, the girl bowed deeply. Not verbal apology, but a small, genuine, heartbreaking action. Avery paused half a second, enough for her eyes to meet the staff's. No blame, no accusation, just a very light nod, acknowledging understanding, and that alone made the staff's shoulders shake. Avery continued, stepping through the main doors where outside light poured in, illuminating her face, and clearly revealing the faint pink mark still on her cheek. Silent but undeniable proof of that morning. Cameras followed closely, but Avery didn't look back. She pulled the suitcase slowly to the curb, shoulders steady like someone needing no proof to anyone. Behind her, Magnolia Crown remained in aftershock. No talking, no gossip, no laughter. Elaine still stood in her earlier position, hand lightly on the counter, observing the scene as if wanting everyone to remember this moment exactly. This wasn't time to celebrate, not to hold heads high. This was when each must look inward and answer the hardest question. What did they do when truth was right before their eyes? And as Avery stepped out those doors, the true morning aftershock wasn't Richard's departure, but the remaining people's silence, silence of self-examination, shame, and faint hope that from now, they could do better. Elaine waited until the hotel doors closed behind Avery, then left her long-standing position. No one dared approach or ask. She stepped outside just minutes after her daughter, leaving Magnolia Crown temporarily to the remaining team. Outside, Avery stood by a low flower bed, hands still on the suitcase strap, face calm but eyes deeper than before, as if the slap hurt less than what she witnessed afterward. Elaine approached, stopping a few steps from her daughter, not too close, not too far. She didn't hug Avery like a mother seeing her child hurt, nor act strong like a CEO resolving a crisis. She just stood, shoulders slightly relaxed, voice lower than usual. "Avery, I'm sorry." Avery turned, eyes without blame, just quiet sadness, not loud, but not easily dismissed. "You have no fault," she said softly. Elaine shook her head. "No, I built this place. I bear responsibility for letting this happen." Avery silent a few seconds. Wind blew, carrying distant car horns and reporters' camera clicks still at a safe distance. "I don't need you to punish them for me," Avery said, eyes on the road, not directly at Mother. "I don't want Magnolia Crown to be where someone is fired just because I'm your daughter." Elaine frowned lightly at that, as if it touched the line she always tried to keep straight between justice and power. "But you were slapped," she said, voice steady but heavier. "No one has the right to do that, no matter who you are." Avery turned to look, this time holding her mother's eyes. "I know," she said, "but you can't build a system based on retaliation. If Magnolia Crown is only strong when you're present, it's not a system." Elaine stood still. Her face tensed briefly, then relaxed, as if Avery had hit the point she herself always feared, that her own power sometimes obscured flaws she couldn't see. "I don't need your intervention to protect me," Avery continued, voice firmer. "I need you to change the system so anyone treated like me is protected, even without a mother who's Elaine Mitchell." Those words made Elaine inhale deeply, not from hurt, but the clarity of truth too obvious. She stepped half closer, raised hand as if to touch Avery's cheek, then stopped mid-air, waiting permission. Avery didn't avoid. Elaine lightly touched the remaining pink mark. "I'll fix it," she said, "not for you, but for all who could be you." Avery nodded lightly. No more words needed. Mother and daughter stood there a few seconds, amid distant camera clicks and fading sunlight, together understanding that morning's crisis was just the start of something larger they must do. Magnolia Crown had partially collapsed, but this was when it began rebuilding properly. 1 week after the crisis, Magnolia Crown reopened. No more tense whispers in the lobby. No more heavy silent avoiding eyes. Instead, hurried, but orderly preparation air, like a body freshly transfused and adjusting to new rhythm. New procedures implemented. Anonymous incident reporting, independent oversight, comprehensive ethics retraining, and most importantly, staff right to refuse unethical requests without fear of punishment. The new hotel rules board hung in 3 most visible lobby spots. Below the Magnolia Crown logo, gold-lettered, "Dignity is the minimum standard." That line wasn't a slogan. It was a commitment. All new and old staff passed it daily, like a reminder no one could ignore. Then, on a light-filled afternoon, Avery returned, unannounced, not using her real name. No privileges. She pulled a small suitcase, identical to the first day, but Magnolia Crown was no longer that day's version. She stood at the front desk. A new, very young staff smiled professionally, but genuinely. "Hello, welcome to Magnolia Crown. How can I assist you?" Avery handed her ID. "I have a reservation." The young receptionist checked info. No awkwardness, no scrutiny, no judging appearance. "Yes, your room is ready. I've prepared chilled water, and if you need any further assistance, please let me know. Here's your key." He pushed the key toward Avery, both hands steady on the counter, perfect standard. No one recognized her. No whispers, no name-check changing faces. As she entered the elevator, a baggage handler passing nodded greeting, not too low, not too high, just proper. Avery stood alone in the elevator car, looking at the mirror reflecting herself, not slap victim, not CEO's daughter, but just an ordinary guest, treated with the respect any person deserves. The change wasn't loud, not flashy. It didn't come from a speech or PR campaign. It came from small standard behaviors, correct gestures, non-judging eyes. Magnolia Crown had become the version Avery believed it could always be. When she opened the room door and entered, afternoon light fell on freshly painted walls, on small details only someone who'd seen the old version would notice. Avery stood in the room a few seconds, then smiled very lightly. The smile of someone seeing hope, no longer an idea but action. So below in the lobby, staff continued work. No one knew the young guest in the elevator. No one knew her story had fundamentally changed. Magnolia Crown. But it didn't matter. What mattered? No matter who she was treated properly. And that was the sign of a new truth. At Magnolia Crown, respect had finally become default, not exception.